Welcome to the teaching ministry of Lakeside Alliance Church. We are a movement of people who are passionate about pursuing Jesus Christ. If you're in Southeast Wisconsin, join us on a Sunday morning and consider partnering in a mission that matters. For now, sit back and open your heart as we hear from God's Word.
We begin Holy Week, and it's Palm Sunday, I recognize, but there'll be many, many, many years of your pastor preaching on Palm Sunday. There's only so many Palm Sunday sermons actually out there. So what we're going to do today is prepare for Holy Week by looking at the crucifixion of Jesus. And my hope is, as we do this, that this helps shape your posture towards and your approach to this week. It's my favorite week, and it's my favorite weekend of the year. Good Friday, Easter is, without question, my personal favorite weekend of the year. And I hope that as we look at this story from Matthew's gospel today, that it will enrich your week and will serve as a wonderful preparation for what is a fantastic time in our church calendar. An archbishop in the Anglican Church was listening to confessions of 3 hardened teenagers in the church. All 3 boys were trying to make a joke out of it, and so they met with the archbishop and they confessed to a long list of ridiculous and grievous sins that they had not committed, just to make a joke out of the whole thing. Once the archbishop figured out what they were doing, he played along with the first 2 who ended up running out of the church laughing. But then he listened carefully to the third prankster, and before he got away, he told the young man, "Okay, you have confessed these sins. Now I want you to do something to show your repentance. I want you to walk up to the far end of the church, and I want you to look at the picture of Jesus hanging on the cross, and I want you to look at his face and say, 'You did all that for me, and I don't care that much.' I want you to do that 3 times. So the boy went up to the front. He looked at the picture of Jesus on the cross. He said, 'You did all that for me, and I don't care that much.' And then he said it again, but he couldn't get through it the third time, and he broke down in tears. And the archbishop who was telling the story said, 'The reason I know that story to be true is I was that young boy.'" There is something about the cross, something about Jesus dying there for us that leaps over all the theoretical discussions, all the possibilities of how to explain it in this way or that way. It leaps off the page and it grabs us. It grasps us. Something takes hold of us as we think about it. And we have a sense, I think in all of us, we have a sense that what's grasping us is the love of God. I hope you find that to be true as we look at this story, the death of Jesus. Matthew chapter 27, starting in verse 45. "Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, 'Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani?' That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "This man is calling Elijah." And one of them ran at once and took a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. And the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs were also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. When the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." There were also many women there, looking on from a distance, who had followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Three things I want to point out: the cross of Christ, the reason for it, the voluntariness of it, and the results it produced. The reason for it, the voluntariness of it, the results it produced. As we do this, my hope is it shapes your whole week. It's Holy Week. It's the apex of the Christian calendar. What is this cross of Christ about? Let's look first at the reason for it. It was dark as night from noon to 3. That's unusual. Of course, there was nothing usual about the execution taking place on this hill called Golgotha outside the city of Jerusalem. Now, speculators love to try to come up with some sort of natural explanation for the occurrence of darkness in the middle of day. The New Testament writers don't particularly care about trying to find some scientific explanation for it. They're more concerned with the theological implications of it. Whispering in the background of this scene is a prophecy from the book of Amos. Amos chapter 8, look at it. On that day, declares the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. This is over 700 years before the crucifixion of Jesus. I will turn your feasts into mourning and all your songs into lamentation. I will bring sackcloth on every waist and baldness on every head. So baldness is in fact a curse. I will make it like the morning for an only son, and the end of it like a bitter day. This passage is promising the judgment of God. Fascinatingly, God is talking about his judgment on his own people, Israel. So hovering over the darkness on the day of our Lord's death is the theme of judgment. Now, if we're right to understand Amos 8, lying underneath the surface of the crucifixion scene, there's a hint in there. The hint is that Jesus is serving as a substitute for his people. It's not Israel, as in the case of Amos, it is not Israel that is under the thumb of God's judgment, but it is Jesus. Given that background, Jesus' cry of desolation in verse 46 is understandable. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, something the careful reader will notice is the subtle theme of abandonment that runs throughout Matthew's gospel. For instance, Jesus is first abandoned by his own countrymen in Matthew 13. Then he's abandoned by his disciples in chapter 16. In the first part of Matthew 27, he's abandoned by the crowds. And the climax of this progressing desertion is the experience of felt abandonment by God himself. Interestingly enough, this abandonment coincides with Jesus addressing God without addressing him as Father. And this is the only place in the Gospels where it happens. It's as if a degree of intimacy has been lost. The intimacy that Jesus, the Son, the second person of the Trinity, has had from eternity past with his Father. A degree of intimacy and closeness has been lost. Why? Why has that been lost? Why is Jesus under the darkness of judgment and abandonment? This gets at the reason for the cross. Let me show you some places where the apostles started to connect dots. They started to say, oh my goodness, this is what happened. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Now, to be very clear, Jesus was not a sinner in nature, thought, word, or deed. But on the cross, God made Jesus to be sin for us. The darkness of judgment and abandonment is Jesus clothing himself in our sin to suffer for it. Related, Romans chapter 8, for God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do, by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin he condemned sin in the flesh. Jesus took on the likeness of sinful flesh. So the darkness of judgment and abandonment is God condemning sin in the flesh of Jesus. Galatians chapter 3, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, curses everyone who is hanged on a tree. Now this curse has nothing to do with witchcraft. It's got nothing to do with Harry Potter. It's an Old Testament quotation. Blessings and curses are all over the pages of the Old Testament. When God is speaking to Israel, revealing to them his will for their lives, he pronounces a number of blessings and curses. You will be blessed if you do this. You will be cursed if you do that. And time and again, the curse is the same. It's exclusion or expulsion from the land and exclusion or expulsion from the community of Israel. The darkness of judgment and abandonment comes from Jesus bearing in himself the curse of exclusion and expulsion because of our sin. This is the reason for it. All this leads Don Carson to conclude, in this cry of dereliction, the horror of the world's sin and the cost of our salvation are revealed. There is a practical usefulness to this historic event. One of the great English hymn writers was a man by the name of William Cowper. Cowper was actually a brilliant scholar who wrote distinguished critical essays for the students of Oxford and Cambridge universities. But in his distinctively Christian work, he combined with his friend and pastor, John Newton, to compose and publish hymns of great depth and power. Sometimes people forget that Cowper wrestled with very deep clinical depression almost his entire life. In fact, he was institutionalized on 4 separate occasions because his depression was so deep and dark. Each time when he was released, he was nursed back to health and strength by a kind Christian woman in the church that Newton was pastoring. About a century after Cowper's death, the great poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote a 3-page poem entitled Cowper's Grave. And in it, she describes the extraordinary influence of Cowper's scholarship, his hymn writing, his personal piety. And then she begins to allude to his horrible dark nights of the soul. And then powerfully referring to Jesus' cry of desolation, she writes, "Yea, once Emmanuel's orphaned cry this universe hath shaken. It went up single, echoless, my God, I am forsaken. It went up from the Holy's lips amidst his lost creation. That of the lost, no son should use these words of desolation." I know we're not all that intimate with poetry these days, but what she's writing is incredibly profound and incredibly helpful. She's saying that Jesus cries this agonizing cry, "My God, I am forsaken," so that for all eternity, William Cowper will not have to. I can imagine that Cowper in his depressions felt utterly abandoned. But Christ's cry ensures that for all eternity, Cowper will never, ever cry that same cry ever again. And so Jesus cries it, "My God, I am forsaken." He does that so that you and me will never have to. When you think about the fact that's one of the many things the cross of Christ accomplished, how could anyone look the crucified Christ in the face and say, "You did all that for me, and I don't care that much"? This is the reason for the cross. Second, the voluntariness of the cross. You see that in chapter 27, verse 50, "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit." There's something very interesting that happens with the gospel writers. They do not talk about Jesus' death in all the typical ways that you talk about a death. The way in which they portray him even dying is unique. Might that mean that there is something about his death that set it apart from all other deaths? Matthew captures it. He describes he yielded up his spirit. It's an interesting way to talk about a death. Conveys an element of voluntariness to his death. Consider this. Most of the crucified, it was common practice in the Roman Empire, most of the crucified We're in an absolute state of exhaustion at the end. But Jesus' utterance of a loud shout doesn't seem to fit that typical condition. I'm putting this softly and I'm putting it as a question, but I don't doubt this for a moment. Jesus absolutely possessed sovereignty over the exact second of his own death. From start to finish, there is a willingness and a voluntariness to all of this that Jesus endured. When you think about the fact that Jesus at any moment could have said, enough of this, I'm out of here. He possessed the authority to do that. Yet he submitted not just to the cross as some sort of inanimate process, but to every moment within it. And so he was never caught up in some sinister plot where he was at the mercy of forces outside his control. There was a voluntariness to all of it. To all of it. Jesus intimated it in John 10. He said, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it up again. Watch what he says. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This charge I have received from my Father. I spent some time just thinking about not just the voluntariness of Jesus saying, okay, I'll come, and then whatever happens to me, happens to me. But Jesus voluntarily coming to earth, having absolute authority over every moment of it, and yet submitting to what's taking place. At any moment saying, I can get out of this, 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 and yet he stayed in it. What does that convey to you? No reluctance, no hesitation, no second thoughts, no question of, is this even worth it, running through his head? Jesus voluntarily and willingly went all in living the life we should have lived and dying the death we should have died. That is a shepherd engaged in a passionate pursuit of his lost sheep at an enormous price to himself. Tom Allen is a former Army Ranger, and he tells this story. He writes, I finally saw Saving Private Ryan about 2 weeks ago. I was extremely proud until the last minute of the movie. As the movie began, I was proud watching the Rangers take Omaha Beach. Then the story begins when they receive a mission to go deep into enemy territory to save Private Ryan. They hit skirmish after skirmish, and some of them are killed along the way. They finally get to where Private Ryan is holed up, and they say, come with us, we've come to save you. He says, I'm not going, I have to stay here because there's a big battle coming up, and if I leave my men, they're all going to die. And so what do the Rangers say? We'll stay here and we'll fight with you. And so they all stay, they all fight. It's gory, it's hard, and almost everyone dies except Private Ryan. At the end, one of the main characters, Tom Hanks, is sitting on the ground. He's been shot and he's dying. The battle's been won. Private Ryan leans over to him and Tom Hanks whispers something to him. Everybody in the theater's crying because Tom Hanks is shot. I was crying because of what he said. It was so terrible. Private Ryan bent down and Tom Hanks said, earn this. The reason that made me angry is no Ranger would ever say, earn this. Why? Because the Ranger motto for the past 200 years has not been earn this. The Ranger motto for the past 200 years has been sua sponte. I chose this. I volunteered for this. So when Private Ryan bent down, if Tom Hanks was really a Ranger, he would have said sua sponte. I chose this. This is free. You don't pay anything for this. I give up my life for you. That's my job. And so when you look at the cross and you see Jesus hanging there, what you do not hear is earn this. You never hear Jesus say, earn this. He doesn't say, I've given everything for you. Now you need to gut it out for me. what he says is sua sponte. I volunteered for this. You don't have to pay anything for it. I chose this. How could anyone at that moment look at the crucified Jesus in the face and say, you did all that for me, and I don't care that much? Third, the results it produced. There's this litany of things that happened that Matthew rattles off. The curtain of the temple was torn in two. The earth shook. The rocks split. The tombs were opened. The bodies were raised. Bam, 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 bam. Lots of action in a short period of time. The curtain that split was most certainly the curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place, where God manifested himself among his people. In the tabernacle, you had those two holy places. One was holy, the other was super holy. The one that was super holy is where the Ark of the Covenant was. That's the place where God would manifest his presence. Only one person from Israel could enter that at any point in time, and that was the high priest on one day, following very specific instructions. That's it. That's the only guy who had access to the presence of God at any point in time in the Israel calendar. There was a temple that separated that from the outer holy place. That's the curtain that's torn in two. To cut to the chase, access to the presence of God was achieved through the death of Jesus. And that's a big deal. One of the tensions in the Bible that runs from Genesis 3 all the way to Revelation 22 is access to the presence of God. Why is that so important? I don't know what you've been told about the presence of God or heaven, but please understand this. God is the sole source of life. Where God is, life is. Life is not found outside of him. Where God is, life is. Where God is, flourishing is. Where God is, paradise is. Where God is, the good life is. Where God is, heaven is. There is no heaven without God. So when Adam and Eve sinned, they were banished from the presence of God. And human beings have been trying to find a way in since. Mentioning the tearing of the veil at the moment of Jesus' death is literally earth-shattering. There is now open access to God through the cross. There is open access to life. There's open access to flourishing and paradise and heaven through the cross of Jesus Christ. And then you've got this earthquake, you've got the splitting of the rocks that could indicate a variety of motives on God's part. And looking at every occurrence in the Bible of these phenomena, one thing is for sure. It is an indicator of God's power. You want to know what's happening at the death of Jesus? God is throwing his weight around. He's on the move. Good luck trying to stop him. And then we get this mention of tombs and resurrected bodies. I'm not going to say more than what the text says. It's going to leave you with questions, but it's going to leave you anchored to the text. Rule of thumb in interpreting the Bible: if you attempt to answer questions the text doesn't answer, you might be satisfied but misguided. Verses 52 and 53 are extraordinarily difficult for two reasons. First, it's short and it lacks parallels. Mark, Luke, and John don't talk about this. You want to know about the resurrection with the tombs and all this stuff? You got it right there. Matthew, that's it. It's unique to Matthew. It's short and it lacks parallels, and that raises all sorts of questions. Questions I have as I read this. Okay, what kind of bodies do these holy people have? Do they die again later? How many people saw them? How public were these appearances? The second reason is difficult, somewhat humorous. It says the people were raised when Jesus died, but they didn't leave the tombs and appear to the citizens of the holy city until after Jesus' resurrection. All right, so the obvious question is, what were they doing? Presumably, too, these tombs were sealed up. So you got alive people behind a rock somewhere, banging on it, get us out of here, get us out of here. Or did they have some sort of resurrected body? They could walk through walls like Jesus did? All sorts of questions we don't have answers to. This is where I have to resist the urge to speculate. While they may leave us with unanswered questions, they simultaneously leave us with incredible hope. One thing we can for sure say: the death and resurrection of Jesus gives new life to Christians who have died. This unique resurrection that occurs at the time of Jesus' death and resurrection foreshadows what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, when he talks about the resurrection that awaits the follower of Christ. If you are a Christian, there is a resurrection in your future. Death will not have the last word. Life will. Flourishing will. Paradise will. Heaven will. God will. And so what do we do with this? What do we do with the cross? What do we do with the reason for it? What do we do with the voluntariness of it? What do we do with the results it produced? Well, remember the words of the archbishop to that young man. Go to the front of the church, look at the picture of Jesus on a cross, and I want you to tell him 3 times, you did all that for me, and I don't care that much. After looking at this text, can you honestly say that? Could you look Jesus in the face and say, Jesus, you did all that for me, and I don't care that much? When you think about the cross providing open access to life, flourishing, paradise, heaven, God himself, are you able to look Jesus in the eye and say, Jesus, you did all that for me and I don't care that much? So much of what the Bible is trying to do in the life of the believer is not for you to walk out here with a list of 10 things to do during the course of the week. What the Bible is trying to do is get you to worship Christ. The whole book is a call to worship. So as we ponder the cross, not just in these moments, but I pray in the days to come, especially this week, my prayer is that you're going to be able to look Jesus in the eye and say, Jesus, you did all that for me, so I bow before you in awe, gratitude, and worship because you are worthy of it all.